So why create an image that both terrifies and reassures at the same time? What's going on psychologically that makes this image such a comfort to countless millions of people?
Well, now we may be able to find the answer, because we now know the moment at which human beings first brought together images of death which both reassure and terrify. It happened here in Italy. Two and a half thousand years ago, a great civilization ruled this land. It had cities, wealth, and beautiful art. No, not the Romans. These people were the Etruscans.
Who laid the foundations of Rome? Not the Romans, the Etruscans.
You thought gladiators were Roman? Well, you're wrong, because they were Etruscan too.
Think straight roads were a Roman idea? Nope, they were Etruscan.
Bridge building, irrigation systems, the Etruscans were superb engineers. They gave Rome the tools to build an empire.
Despite this, for a long time it was believed that little remained of this once great civilization. Then, in the 19th century, archaeologists began to prove otherwise, with a series of discoveries that would give us the final chapter of our story. They lay buried underground, because down here are thousands upon thousands of Etruscan tombs. This is where the Etruscans buried their dead. And they're some of the most reassuring visions of the afterlife ever created.
I'm in the tomb of the Matuna family, who lived in Cervetri about 2,500 years ago. And although this was designed for them in their death, it's got a very cosy feel about it.
The Matunas were given tools for farming, livestock, cooking utensils, a flagon of wine, beds, and even little luxuries, such as a pair of slippers for those cold winter mornings. With all this food, the only problem the Matunas may have faced in the afterlife is mice. But thoughtfully, the artist has created a cat.
The tombs were designed as houses for the dead, so they've got all the features that you'd expect from a house. We've got doorways leading into bedrooms, ensuite of course, windows, really sturdy roof beams.
They made them to last. Thousands of years after the wooden houses of the living have disappeared, the stone cities of the dead still stand. For the Etruscans, death seemed to be simply a joyful continuation of life.
If I were an Etruscan, I'd be looking forward to my death. But it wasn't the whole story. There was a dark side to the Etruscan view of the afterlife.
And it was dramatically revealed to the world 20 years ago. In 1985, Italian workers were digging a trench for a new pipeline to supply the town of Tarquinia with water. They came across yet another buried Etruscan tomb and called in the archaeologists. The archaeologists pushed a tiny camera through the earth to investigate. What they first saw was what they expected to see. Covering one wall of the tomb were the kind of enchanting images for which the Etruscans were famous. Anyone buried here would be surrounded by paintings of a reassuring afterlife. Then the archaeologists turned their camera around, and what they saw on the opposite wall shocked them. Here were paintings of disturbing and unsettling creatures, images intended not to reassure, but to terrify. This is the Blue Demon, the hook-nosed creature from the Etruscan underworld. The demon's skin is the colour of rotting human flesh. He has a snake coiled around his arms. Beside him is a winged devil, ready to drag the dead off to an underworld of pain and suffering. An Etruscan artist devised this vision of a terrifying afterlife around 420 BC, making it perhaps our oldest surviving image of hell. It's not intended to reassure, quite the opposite. When they dated this tomb, archaeologists realized it marked a watershed. For the previous 200 years, Etruscans had created tombs full of images promising only a happy afterlife. But then something had changed. By 400 BC, the Etruscans were combining in a single work of art images of death that were both reassuring and terrifying, rather as we do today. So what had happened? Well, at this time, the Etruscans were being threatened by the rise of another Italian civilization, a greedy and aggressive people who would steal their land and destroy their culture. Who else but the Romans? The Etruscans knew the Romans were coming, and they knew they needed to resist them at all costs. Their tombs became a resonant call to arms because they offered a stark choice. Would you be damned or saved? These images of hell reminded the Etruscans of the gruesome fate that awaited them if they failed in their duty and surrendered. But these images of a reassuring afterlife promised Etruscans their reward if they stood up to the imminent threat. For the first time in history, these conflicting images had been brought together. The Etruscans gave us the earliest images of hell, and in doing so, they created the first ever images of what we today would call redemption.
The cleverness of redemption is that it can lead people to actually look forward to death rather than dreading it. The idea of sacrifice for the greater good is widespread. The idea of falling on that grenade for one's buddies. And then of course what we do is we memorialize such people. They're remembered more than the rest of us.
And that's why the cross is unique. It's the one single image that's working on the human mind in two opposing ways. It's a terrifying image representing pain, loss and suffering. And yet at the same time it's an image that reassures, one that holds out hope. This combination has made the cross one of the most powerful symbols ever. And it explains why so often it's been used to try to give meaning in the face of the incomprehensible loss of life.